Hello everyone, and thank you so very much for watching this new live event, which is lesson number 16 from the Spring Fundamentals stream, and we will discuss about Spring Boot Actuator. If you have questions and you are watching the event live, you have a live chat there. I always have an eye on the live chat, so you can ask questions and I will directly answer them. Or if you have questions afterwards, or you are watching the event recorded, you can still ask questions in the comments section, or you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter and ask me the questions there, and I will create separate videos for you or simply answer you in a next lesson. So we can continue now with our Actuator, which is one of the subjects that I really enjoy, the subjects that I really like, and this is because the Actuator is actually a link between the application and the installation of your application in a real environment. So it is a link between the application, the tool that orchestrates your containers that run your application, the infrastructure as well, and of course the monitoring tools. And this is why you should know about the Actuator. You will use the Actuator, and this is really an important tool for your microservices. You will have it in all your microservices that are deployed in a production environment, so you have to know about it, and I will provide you with the most important things about the Actuator now in this video. So in order to start, it's always better if we just create a new project and add the needed dependencies. So just let's start with our IDE, creating a new Spring Boot project, and I will just take the Spring Initializer, as always the latest version, and then I have my group ID and then the name of the artifact. This is lesson number 16, so I will name it E16. And the dependencies that we need is, of course, we will need the Actuator that you will find somewhere under the operationals here. As I've said, this is a link between our application and the part of the operationals, so it's somehow considered at the edge of the DevOps. Wherever we think about the border between the development and where is the start of the operationals, here we have some parts that are somewhere in the middle, and the Actuator, even if it's part of your application, it is a part of your application that is dedicated for monitoring and managing the inside of your application, and that's why this is more or less related to the operationals. It is not a part of the application that you will actually use in the business development. So until now we have learned during the previous 15 lessons a lot of things that are used in the development of the business logic of your application. And even if some of them were more technical, like the transactions, for example, the data sources, connection to the database, and usage of different kinds of databases and persistence, they still are part of things that you are using for developing the business logic, the use cases in your application. But the Actuator is different. The Actuator is more linked to the operationals. It goes into the insides of your applications, and you can use it to have the metrics of your application, the metrics of the system on which the application is running, the healthiness of your application. I will just tell it in more details what this is, some information regarding the application that needs to be known by a third-party component of your system in the whole architecture that considers also the deployment part and everything else. Because when we discuss about production environment, is not only the application that you are developing, and I know what some of you are thinking now. Even if you are a developer, trust me, you have to be aware at least of some of the parts of the infrastructure as well. You have to be aware about some of the parts of the installation of your application. the abstraction that's used there, if it's a virtual machine abstraction like an infrastructure as a service or containers or serverless, the architecture, the main architecture, everything is related like the pieces in a puzzle. And even if you are not an expert in everything, because yes, nobody is an expert in everything, you are the developer, so you know very well how to develop Spring applications, or at least now you really know how to develop Spring applications very well, because you have watched the 15 of these lessons, so you know a lot of things already. But you still have to be aware, trust me, about also the other parts. And yes, you are not, probably you will not be an expert in all the clouds, you will not be expert in all AWS, Azure, Oracle, Google, and so on. There are so many, Alibaba and so many, and you can't be an expert in everything, and you can't be even an expert in maybe one of the clouds together with all the other things, but you still have to be aware of them. And that's because there are parts of the application that are the responsibility of the developer, like the actuator, that is related, is like a bridge between your application and the operationals. So this is the actuator that we want to add to our new application. And the actuator, as I have said, it provides information about how your application works, where is your application running, the state of your application, things that are considered to be the management of the application itself, not related to the business logic and the implementation of the business logic. So everything that's technically related to how is your application doing, if it's running fine, where is it running, if the system in which the application is running is doing fine, if you have enough resources. And that's what you will integrate with the orchestrator. An orchestrator, for example, like Kubernetes, would actually test your application, that your application is running using the actuator. In case you have a Spring Boot application, this would be the best choice, and we'll test the healthiness or the readiness of your application, and depending on that, we'll know to couple or decouple the service from a load balancer, or even destroy and recreate the container if the application is stuck. Take some metrics, save some metrics. You will be able to implement your metrics with some systems, of some alarm systems or some monitoring or some logging systems, and this is why this is really important. The actuator provides all these details in two ways. There are two possible ways in which you can get all this information from the actuator, and those are via some REST endpoints, or we will call this shortly the web way of taking the actuator data, or via JMX. And in order to use the web, which is the most used of them all, so I will still focus in this video by using the web way of taking the data, because it's the easiest to do. You still have to know that you can use JMX as well, but we will use web because definitely this is most of in most of the cases used, and the biggest probability that you will have to deploy your application, for example, and let's assume that you have an orchestrator like Kubernetes. You will probably use the health endpoint from the actuator to do that, and you will have the web approach. So in order to do that, in order to use the web approach, the actuator itself is not only important, you have also to add the web dependency as well. And we will add this web dependency for two reasons. One of them is that maybe I will also implement an endpoint itself of mine, and of course if you want to use the actuator with the web approach, so the endpoints that will be provided, they will be provided as well, they depend on the web dependencies. So in order the actuator to be able to provide you the REST endpoints, it as well has to have the web dependency. So that's why I have these two dependencies, at least in my demo project here. And of course, depending on whatever your application is doing, you will also have some other dependencies. You already know that. And now I can finish by creating this project, where now I know that I have the needed dependencies. So being that I have the needed dependencies, then of course I will be able to to prove you the needed concepts about the actuator. So let's see which are these. First of all, I would just like to run this application. So it's an application where I have actually done nothing. As you are already aware, Spring Boot does a lot of auto configuration. So because of that, you don't need to actually do anything when you add a dependency. You will already have a lot of configuration done, and when you start now your application, actually, even though we didn't add a line of code to our application, we already have plenty of things. So I will start from what we already have without doing any change, and then we will see example by example which are the changes that you need to do and which are the aspects that you are provided with whenever you are doing anything with our actuator. So yes, just running the application now, and because I have the web dependency, actually I already expect that a Tomcat will be started on the port 8080, and you see the port is here, and whatever else you will see is a line that will tell you exposing two endpoints under the path /actuator. So this is something that you didn't see until now in our examples, and this is that is because actually this is the part of the functionality that was auto configured because of our actuator dependency that we have just added in the beginning. So of course, if you go to the POM.xml, you can check that your actuator dependency has been added to the POM.xml. So this is the actuator dependency. The Spring Boot Starter actuator is the reason for why you will see now this also this line of code, but as well all of the things that we are actually discussing about. So being that our server is now started on port 8080 and we know that we have a /actuator path, let's see what this actuator path is by simply opening a postman and calling the endpoint to see what do we actually get from this actuator path. So it's http localhost 8080 and was actuator, the path, and then we call this nice endpoint. We didn't write it, but somehow we got this endpoint, and what we actually see is a bunch of other endpoints that we can actually call, and there are a few of them, and actually they represent only two of the needed functionality that is provided by the actuator, and these are the info endpoint and the health endpoint. And here you also see is the actuator itself provided in the response. So this is actually exactly the endpoint that we have called here. So we have the health and the info. These are endpoints of the actuator, and they are actually the only two endpoints that are active by default, because the actuator is providing you, as I will just show you soon, with many other endpoints. So we will discuss about these two, but not only about these two, because we have others as well. But before discussing about the endpoints themselves, I would like to show you that we can also change the port on which these endpoints are provided by the by our Tomcat in Spring Boot. And maybe you are wondering, why is that important? Maybe you think that you also already know that the port can be changed with the server port property in the application properties file, but this is actually really important. So it's one of the reasons I want to start with this, is that the change of the port of the actuator endpoint, in this case, it's really important. And going back to our application, I will show you that this is basically it can be done very easy by using the property management port. So be careful, that is this is actually not the server port itself that we have used until now. That property is changing the port for all the other endpoints. that are running in your application, and I know that we have already seen that from actually I think the beginning of Spring Boot lessons. So when we have starting with Spring Boot, it was one of the first properties that we have actually seen. Now we will actually see that beside the server port itself, we have also the management server port, and the management server port is related to only the Actuator endpoints, and it's really important in a real life scenario that you have a different port from the other endpoints. So by default, Spring Boot will provide these endpoints on the same port as all the other endpoints of your application, but you usually don't want to have it like that. You separate the business case endpoint by from the management endpoints, the Actuator endpoints, by the port, and this is because it is one of the easiest way then to simply make sure that these endpoints from the Actuator are not accessible publicly. Usually you won't want these endpoints to be accessible publicly. Of course you can do that if you think that's what your application should do, but in general, in most of the cases, as you will see in these examples in this video, the Actuator endpoint and endpoints provide sensitive data that you usually don't want to be accessible for everybody. So that's why one of the easiest ways to secure first the application is to simply put all the endpoints on a separate port and then block them directly from the firewall, so you make them accessible only inside your network. So you have defense zone in which these are accessible, because usually, as I've said, only the internal tools that you have need to access these endpoints, like your monitoring tool, like the tool that is investigating your logs, like your orchestrator that's orchestrating your containers and deploying your application, and so on. So you don't actually need to make this public in the internet. And then you can still use the server port itself to change the port for the other endpoints. You can do that. So in my case, if I restart the application now, if I have any kind of endpoints that I create myself by using REST controller and request mapping, get mapping, post mapping, and so on, they will be accessible on port 7070. And because I have the Actuator dependency in my POM XML and I have the Actuator endpoints provided default by my Spring Boot application, they will be accessible on the 9090 port. So previously in my Postman, I have used 8080 to access the Actuator. That will not be possible anymore. Now I have changed the ports. I should update it and I should use 9090. So you see now all my links are on the new port, and if I have an endpoint of myself, then I will simply access it on 7070. And by this, it's very easy from the beginning to make sure that your endpoints are only accessible inside your network, and you make sure by a firewall or something that you don't make them accessible publicly. And then of course you can still use Spring Security with these endpoints. There are some normal endpoints, so everything that we have discussed about Spring Security, and you have an entire playlist out there on which I describe a lot of things already about Spring Security on the same channel. They are applicable also to the Actuator endpoints, and you can have now they are accessible without any kind of security, but you can use what you have learned from the Spring Security and secure these endpoints as well if you feel that's the need of your system. And being that we know this now, and we have seen, you have also in the console here the two ports. Probably if you are attentive, you will see the 9090, which exposes the Actuator, and somewhere above is the 7070 as well. So both ports are now exposed, and different endpoints are exposed on these ports. We can now continue with our Actuator endpoints to see what can we actually do with this Actuator. But as you have seen, and you have to keep in mind that by default you only have two functionalities of the Actuator enabled. One is the info port, the info endpoint, which is used only to retrieve information about your application. I will show you immediately how is this done. And the other one is the health endpoint, which is probably the mostly used endpoint of them all from the Actuator suite. And that's because health endpoint is that endpoint meant to check the healthiness of your application. So in this case, the health endpoint is for example called from your orchestrator, like Kubernetes is configured and called at a certain interval of time to check your application that's healthy or not, and depending on that the orchestrator can take the action to restart your application by recreating the container. So that's why the health endpoint used to check the healthiness of the application is one of the most used endpoints from the Actuator. But before starting with them, I want actually to show you that we have many more functionalities and many more endpoints in the Actuator. So in order to enable to use them, you have actually to enable them manually, and you can do that from the application properties, application YAML file, and you have to use the properties that are starting with management. And you have here there are these two kinds of management properties: the management endpoint, where you will have the configuration on a specific endpoint, or the management endpoints, where you have the configuration for the group of endpoints, for all of them. So for example, like we have here the management endpoints web exposure exclude, and yes, we will actually not use the exclusion here, we will use the inclusion. And these two properties that you see here include, you can see that by default have the value health and info, are exactly those two endpoints that you have seen, and they are by default accessible. If you want, you can exclude them. If you want, you can include others. So in our case, to be very unspecific, and because it's only a demo example, I just simply want to make all of them available, and you should now see almost all the endpoints. There is one exception, but now you will actually see a lot more endpoints here with this. And if you restart the application, of course, then all the other endpoints should be now accessible. We have one endpoint that shouldn't be accessible by default, even by including everything, and that's the shutdown endpoint. Is an endpoint considered to be very sensitive, and because of that it is not enabled by default. So even after you include all the endpoints, you still have to enable it manually. It is not really, it's important for you to know that it exists. You will not probably see it very often used. It is an endpoint that when you call, you can call using the post method, and whenever you call it, it shuts down your application. So if you want something like this, you can even do it directly through the Actuator endpoint, but you have to explicitly activate it. So even after including everything, you still have to explicitly activate the shutdown in order to have it available. So that's why I expect that now I will see practically all the other possibilities. You see that I have now many more possibilities here that have appeared beside those. I still don't have here the shutdown endpoint. So the shutdown endpoint is still not available because it has to be activated by hand by itself to make it available. So we will leave it at the end if we still have time, because it's less important. But now you still see that you have plenty of endpoints that allow us a lot of functionality and a lot of information, sensitive information. I would not like you to have this accessible publicly in your applications. trust me, these are things that seen by the right person, they could be used to check out the vulnerabilities of your applications and of your systems, and they can be used to attack then your system and then find out breaches and ways to get into your system. So you really don't want to make all this information public accessible. That's why usually we set up a different port, and we even use frameworks like Spring Security to secure the endpoints wherever is needed. Now we will take them one by one, and I will actually start with the easiest one, which is the info endpoint. And the info endpoint, as you have seen, it's even available if you didn't include all of the endpoints. If you call the info endpoint, by default you see nothing, and but you can of course configure the info endpoint so that it shows you the information about your application. And usually this is static information that you can set up in your properties file. You can even configure your Spring Boot compilation Maven plugin to automatically take the information from the POM XML and put it here. And as you will see in the next examples, you can actually make it programmatically, but usually you will see it only static. So how would you actually do it static? Is in your properties or YAML file, you use the info prefix and then whatever you want to be added, like info, application, author, and then this is me, info, application version, and this is again some value that you want to add. And you can actually add whatever you think is needed to be seen. This will automatically transform this data in some kind of a REST of a JSON response, and then you will see this response as a JSON in your info endpoint. So pretty easy. Again, usually this application is static, so you simply have it from somewhere defined static. And if you really want to make it dynamic, like take it from a database or from a web service or something like this, you can still do that as well. Spring Boot and the Actuator are very flexible, and they are configurable, and then you can actually configure your application to really do that. So now that I have restarted my application, I can go to the Postman and check the info endpoint, and you can see that my details that I have written under the info became a JSON response, and now this is what my info endpoint is returning. So this is how you configure your info endpoint for your application. The second important, again, this was to warm you up, actually is not that important, but the important, maybe the most important of the endpoints is actually the health endpoint. Let's find out where the health endpoint is. Again, this is one of the endpoints that you have seen is available without you including anything. It's included by default, and you can call the health endpoint directly to see the health of your entire application, or you can call it for a specific component, and you can for a component have even instances separately. And usually you are interested in the health itself of the entire application, that is form of all the components that are tested against. So in our case, we can have the disk space, the CPU, the database, access to a specific web service. So this actually all of this, if you add to the health endpoint, depending of how complex your application is, all of them will have a status, and in the end you will have a general status of the health of your application that is somehow like an end between all the statuses. So if all of them are up, then the entire status is up. If at least one of them is down from the components, then your entire status will be down. So let's call the health endpoint to see what's the result. You will actually see that because my application is a pretty small one, I have almost nothing to check, and by default I only see a status up. That means yes, application is responding. So if an orchestrator, for example, will call this endpoint, it's only interested on the status, and as long as the endpoint can be called, so it's not timing out, and the status is up. Everything is considered to be up and running. In some cases, you would like to add also to your state some sensitive considered data, that is, as I've said, the disk space, for example, previously, or the database. And in this case, you have to actually configure it yourself. So you have to specify using management endpoint. By the way, I'm not sure why, but IntelliJ suggests me to enable the shutdown. It was that one that we have discussed in the beginning, but this is not what I want to do now. Is management endpoint, and then we have health, show details, and we have 3 options for the show details. By default is never. We can use this when authorized. If we are using Spring Security to authorize our application, we can do something like you can still access the endpoint, but you will not see details if you are not authorized, or you will see details if you are authorized. Or we can simply, as I will do here because I don't have any security enabled, I will just specify that I always want to see the details, and then this automatically will add some details to my health endpoint, so I will see more than that up. I will also see the disk space in this case because the application is still very small, so I don't have any other components that would be tested against, but I will still see something more than just the status up. I will see the components, and the only component probably that I will see is the disk space. And yes, these are the details now, and the components that have appeared here. The disk space is up. How much disk space do I still have? Which is the threshold against when this happens, the component will be considered down. If one of the components is down, then the entire status will be down. So you can provide more details using this property, and you can do that configurable. Either you don't want you don't want to be able to see the details, or you simply want to see the details only when you are authorized, or maybe you always want to see the details. So this is the health endpoint. The health endpoint being very important again because it is the endpoint usually, and its purpose is to be used by tools like orchestrators to see if your application is up and running, so by that to restart your application. And you can customize the health endpoint. So this is another important thing, because by default you will have some components that are added depending on the configuration itself of your application, but sometimes you want to customize the health itself. For example, maybe in case of your application the healthiness is considered to be down if a specific web service is not accessible. So this is something that is typically related to your application. It can't be that somehow Spring might implement something like that for you. So you can only do something like this by customizing your endpoint itself. And you can customize this endpoint, this health endpoint. Usually the first way to do that, and the most encountered way, is simply by adding new health indicators. How do you add a new health indicator? You simply declare a class that's implementing the health indicator interface. So let's do that ourselves now here to see how is that possible. How can we actually write something like this? I will create a new package that I will call the Actuator, and then inside I will create another package. I always like to organize very well my packages, and I will call it health, and then inside I will create my custom health indicator, and this will actually implement the interface health indicator. And then of course we will have to override the health method. That is the method that will implement the logic of healthiness in your case. So the custom healthiness, whatever you want to call it. So we implement this, and then of course this is implementing the health indicator, but you should also not forget to make it a bin in your context. So either by adding a stereotype annotation, either by using the @bin annotation in the configuration class. Make sure that you have an instance of this class, otherwise it will not be seen. Memory consumption. Hi Alexander, I'm not sure if I understand what do you want, what do you mean by memory consumption. What you have related to the disk space itself is and by default is what you have seen, so that's the memory consumption, if you want to call it like this. So like the disk space, total and free, and the threshold. But if you want something more than this, so if this is not enough for your application, this default implementation, then the other option is to do exactly what I'm showing you here, to implement a custom health indicator. And by a custom health indicator, you can actually do whatever you want. You can actually implement whatever you want. This is what I'm trying to show you now how to do this. So it's simply by just creating a class, implementing this interface. You can have as many custom health indicators as you want, so you can do multiple if you want to have more options. And then the only thing that should happen is in this method, whenever you consider that your health is up, you have this health class is actually a builder, and then you can use the builder methods to build your instance. For example, you can say is up, and then you can provide even details. We can give a set of keys and values that are details of your application. You can do that by details with a map, or you can simply add them key and value as well. Okay, to RAM memory, now I understand. Yeah, the disk space is just the disk space. If you want the RAM memory, you don't have, from what I know, a custom already implementation in Spring Boot for that, but with a health indicator you can do that by the means of testing yourself, like the RAM memory, by using specific kind of I'm not sure if with the JDK itself can be done. Maybe it can be done with the JDK itself as well. And also you can do that by using a third-party library, if this is part of your health. But as you will see, actually we also have the metrics. So I will just, after the health, I will go to another endpoint that is called the metrics, and the metrics is what you can actually test in terms of also memory consumption, CPU, how your JVM is working, and so on. And then you can mix them together. You can even mix the health indicator with the metrics, and you can do a custom indicator like I'm doing here. I'm just showing you how to do it, but when we will discuss about the metrics, you will actually see that you can use the metrics to create a custom health indicator, and then to use, for example, the RAM or something related to the performance. So yes, you can do something like this. It's not directly like you just write a property and in the properties file and it's working, but you can use and you can implement a custom health indicator to do that. So to continue, you will understand this immediately. To just first to know how to create your health indicator, you can have the health up and down, and you can even provide the details, as I've said, like I have a key and I have a value. This is optional. This is optional to have details, is not mandatory. At the end, of course, being a builder, you have to call the build method, and this will create your instance. So what will happen now is that if I'm restarting the application and I call again the health endpoint, you will see that the status is up and I have this detail ABC BCD. By the way, the status by default have the value up and down. You can change even the value of the status, which is not necessarily recommended, but again allowed by the framework, because a framework should be flexible. Maybe there is some kind of tool that you want to use and where the statuses should have other values than up and down, and you can even do that by this builder. So now if I send again the request, what I will actually see is that beside the disk space that has been added as a default itself from the property, I have now my custom indicator here. And again, in my custom indicator, I can have whatever status I want, I can have whatever details I want. And usually I will use the statuses up and down because that's the standard, but even this value can be changed if you want, even this one. So in my case, and to show you how to make it down as well, if I would have said that the status is down, I can even include an exception here if I want. Then the status will be down. So when I will call again this endpoint, one of the components will be down, which is my custom component, and then the entire status of the application will be down, because if at least one of the components is down, then the entire status of the application is down. Okay, so let me show you from the Postman this as well before going to the metrics. So I have now make it to be down, and that is one of them is down, one is up, but the entire status at the end, the final status is down, because if at least one of the components is down, then the entire application is considered to be down. So this is how it's working. And of course, in a real case scenario, you won't have simply directly returning. You will have some condition here. If something happens, then it's up, otherwise it's down. It can be, if I have enough RAM memory, then it's up. If I don't have enough, then it's down. And how can I take the memory? I can do it myself by using some kind of a library, or I can use directly the metrics, as I will show you in the next. It's just the next endpoint that I want to show you. So I hope the health indicator and the way you create a custom health indicator is now clear, because I just want now to go back to my actuator, and I will show you. We have here the metrics, and these are the metrics. And let's see what do we actually have here. You can see all the metrics by calling directly the endpoint. So these are all the metrics that you have that are monitored, and you have here, you have the thread states, the garbage collector memory, the JVM memory. That's probably your question, Alexandru. The JVM memory used, the system CPU, and so on. I won't read all of them. You can see them here. You can try all of them when you will need them. And now, in order to see one of them, for example, if I want to see the JVM memory used, for example, I just take the name of the metric and then I say it like this. I just want the JVM memory used, and now here it is. You have all the memory that's used here in the details. You have everything that is actually related. So the measurement itself, which is the value that you need, and all the other details related to this specific metric. And again, you can use this similarly. You can use any of those metrics, any of the metrics that you actually want. Okay, so this is the second very important endpoint, the metrics. And the very nice thing actually is that you can use the endpoints themselves in your application. For example, if I want to have an endpoint that is calling the health, for example, I have my own controller. Let's assume that I create my own controller here, and for some reason it really needs to have access to the health. Then you will see its controllers, and this is my demo controller, and this is just, as I've said, the normal REST controller with some kind of a method that's doing something, and that you access somehow. And then you want to use, for example, the health endpoint. So if you want to use the health endpoint, and I think metrics endpoint as well, okay, is available. And then the only thing that you actually need to do is to inject itself the metrics endpoint or the health endpoint, depending what you actually need, with a simple auto wire. And then you can return, and you can use, not return, you can use this in your application. So for example, in my case, I can do my own endpoint where I use the health endpoint. So from my application, I can have the benefit of using the endpoints from the actuator. So for example, as the previous question was, can I use, for example, something like the RAM or something like, I don't know, anything that is related to the metrics here. So for example, any of the metrics that you have here, if you want to include it in the healthiness of your application, then you can actually, what you can actually do is that you can go to your indicator and then inject here your custom health indicator, and then inject here the metrics endpoint, which you can auto wire, and then you can decide the health of this component, of this custom component, by using the metric itself. And you can see here the metric method requires a metric name, and then it will actually return you the value for that metric, and then you can use it, for example, like the memory of the virtual machine, or something like this, the maximum memory of the heap, or whatever you have there. So this is what I meant, that you can use the metrics in your health indicator. So you can do a custom health indicator that uses any of the metrics that you have, if you want to do something very custom, for example, and do a healthiness based on some of the metrics that you have. And of course, if the metrics are not here that you need, you can anytime go and benefit of a third-party library and add it to your dependencies and create a custom health indicator that's using that library, and then decides the healthiness of your application based on whatever implementation you have. So info endpoint, healthiness, very important. Metrics, again, we have seen the metrics usually are not necessarily, as I have showed you, used in creating custom health components, but they are integrated with alarm systems or simply monitoring systems. And I want to show you another very nice thing, actually, is that if you go to the properties file, you will see that you can export your metrics, and it's already created. The export for your metrics is already created for a lot of known systems, like AppOptics, for example, Atlas, for example, Datadog, for example, Dynatrace, and so on, Elastic. There are a lot of functionalities only simply configurable by properties. So already the folks that are developing Spring Boot, they have created for all these systems that are used to monitor your application configuration through the properties. So the classes and the code is already written. So if you use one of the most used of these tools, and Prometheus as well, very used and very common together with Kubernetes and OpenShift. If you use some of these tools, you even don't have to implement something of your own. You can directly only configure some properties here, and that will automatically integrate the actuator with your tool. So that's extraordinary, the fact that you can do that by setting up only a couple of properties. Sometimes 4 or 5 properties are enough to implement your connectivity between the metrics provided by the actuator and your system. So you can do that in so many ways, and sometimes with Spring Boot you have even the opportunity of doing that only by setting up some properties, which is incredible. So that's what I wanted to show you, is that is not even needed sometimes to have the metrics itself as an endpoint available and call it from somewhere. You can sometimes just set up some properties and will automatically do the linkage between your application and your favorite tool. And then beside this, which are really nice and really important, you can see some others, and I will just want to go through all the others to make sure that I have shown you at least some of them. So you can see some audit events, but you can also even see the beans in your context, in your Spring context. So maybe it looks crazy, but you have an endpoint where you can actually see the beans that you have. So call this endpoint and you will actually see that here as a JSON response, you have all the beans in your context. You see all the pre-configured beans and all the beans that you have configured with their scope, their type, and details about them, even the dependencies that they have. So you have an entire graph here of dependencies between beans that is provided by only calling this endpoint, which is so easy. Imagine that you can even have now a graphical tool that is displaying your relation between the beans outside of your application and integrate it so easy with your microservices. And then we have caches, the same thing. You see, if you have configured caches, you can see the caches that you have configured. We have already discussed about the health. There are the conditions on which is the auto configuration is done, configuration properties, details about the environment on which this is running, the info endpoint, of course, loggers that are configured. Whenever you log something to your console, you have the configuration and the loggers. You can even do a heap dump and a thread dump. So you don't even need, like in the old days, you had a profiler and you had to connect with a profiler to the production environment. It was crazy. You couldn't even do that in some situations for security purposes, and that's now so easy to take a thread dump, for example, and see why was an application stuck. Maybe just before restarting it, you want to take this data to be able to investigate it and find out what problem, what multi-threading problem you have, and you have for sure learned how to use a thread dump for that. And in the past we used profilers to do that, and sometimes it was very, very difficult to take the thread dump. Now it's only for our Spring Boot application at the call of a method of an endpoint. The heap dump as well, if you want to investigate the heap dump, you have a memory leak that you want to investigate, it is pretty easy. The only thing that you need to do is to call the heap dump endpoint, and you get an entire heap dump, and then you can use a tool to investigate the heap dump and see whatever memory problems you have, if any. The metrics that we have discussed, schedule tasks. Even scheduled tasks are here. If you have scheduled tasks, you can see the details about them by the call of this endpoint. So a lot of information out of the box provided by the Actuator that you can integrate with your tools for monitoring, and that you can even use inside your application. Again, usually is rarely seen to use these details inside the application, but is fairly often seen that you can you use these endpoints together with a tool that then shows you nice graphical perspective of how are your microservices doing, and that allows us in production to know everything that we need to find out all the issues that we have and correct them. And even if sometimes microservices architecture are complex and are pretty difficult to understand, if you have tools like this and you have applications prepared, mature to be used, this creates our lives really, really easy when we have to deal with problems, because it's very, very easy to find out which are the problems, spot them fast, correct them very rapidly using today's tools. I think mostly this is it. I still have to show you how to create your own endpoint. Maybe you were wondering, can I create my own endpoint in the Actuator? The answer is yes. You can even create your own endpoint. So you can customize endpoints. You can work with the endpoints like the health, where you define components in the endpoints, or you can simply create your own endpoints if something like this is needed. And to create your own endpoint, it is pretty easy, but be careful. It was changed. This was changed between Spring 1 and Spring 2. This was actually, if I remember correctly, in Spring 1 you were doing this by implementing the endpoint interface, and now we will use the endpoint annotation for that. So for example, here, if I want to create my package actuator endpoints, and then I create a custom endpoint. Let's call it my custom endpoint. Then in Spring Boot 2 you only have to have it as a component, and then you use the endpoint annotation. And in the endpoint annotation you should also specify the ID of the endpoint. I'm not sure exactly if this is if I have imported correctly this annotation. One second. Yeah, I think this is the endpoint. Yeah, actually. And then inside you can have multiple operations, and let's, for example, do a test to make sure. We have to annotate it with, and we have the option to choose between read operation, write operation, and delete operation. Depending on the annotation that you choose, actually you will have to use a get, a post, or a delete method when calling the endpoint. And then you can return whatever you want here. So you can simply just return a smiley face, for example. Of course, usually you would return something that's needed, an information or something, probably as a form of an object, not only a string. I just want to prove you now that my endpoint, my new endpoint, should be part of the Actuator endpoints, and I can use it as well if I want. So you can, again, as a conclusion, you can even implement your own endpoints if you want. I'm not sure what happened here. I didn't specify the ID in the end, sorry for that. I have to provide a name, so how do I call it? My endpoint, whatever I want. And then I choose my endpoint to call it through the actuator, and then I see the smiley face. So you can implement your own endpoints in the actuator if that's your need. Okay, after we see this, we will also see another and the last possibility that I want to present it to you today is the customization of the endpoints. So if I now call the actuator, beside everything I have also my endpoint. You see it here. So my endpoint actually appeared here. And if I call my endpoint, then I see the smiley face. So I just implemented my own endpoint in the actuator. Be aware that in Spring Boot 1 you had actually to implement an interface, so it was a little bit different than the way I have done it here, but you were still able to do that in Spring Boot 1 as well. And again, if you want to actually customize an endpoint, then you can use a web extension for that. So let's create all this as well. I want to show you, for example, maybe you were wondering if the info endpoint or some other endpoint can be extended somehow. Sometimes it happens that the information of your application is not something static. It comes from somewhere as well, from a database, for example, from a web service. And let's see, can I extend the info endpoint such that now the information is not a static one coming from the properties, but is something that is coming from a database? And of course the answer is yes, we can do that. And then I should create a web extension. So to do that, I just create a class. And then on this I will also add the component to make it a bean. And then I should actually use the web endpoint web extension, sorry. And for the endpoint web extension, I always have to provide which is the endpoint that I extend. So in my case is the info endpoint. Sorry, not as a string, it's actually the class itself. So it would be info endpoint. And then I will just write my operation here. Usually if I extend an endpoint, then I can return it as a string. It will actually work, but it's easier if I use a web endpoint response, because if I use a web endpoint response, I can also set up the status of the HTTP call. So in this case, it would be something like new web endpoint response of whatever I want to return here as a string, and that's from the generic type here, and that's the read operation here. Okay, so let's see what happens now if we run the application. And then I will show you that by a second parameter we can even set up the status of the HTTP call, of the HTTP response, if we want. And yes, of course, this is just statically returned by me, but in a normal application, in a production case scenario, this will happen, to be taken from somewhere, from, as I've said, the database or something like this. So now I'm going back to the info endpoint, and you see the result is now not the details that I have in the properties, is my logic that I have written here. So this info that was returned is this one, and the status is by default 200 OK. But using this web endpoint response, for example, I can for some reason just change the HTTP status and make it a 204, which is no content. And I have even the opportunity to change all the details on the response, like the status as well, if I want to do that. So I can even change the status on the response. So waiting a little bit for the application to restart, I want to show you also the new status. So previously, not only the endpoint was returning the new information, but the status was 200. And now it's also, it's not returning because I happen to use no content here, and when you use no content, you can't have any content, which is normal. But you can change the status. That's what I wanted to show you actually. So now I have changed it to no content, and then the application, the information is not here because of that. I could have changed it, for example, to 404, and then I could have also a body for the response. So you can add your own endpoint, customize the endpoints, extend the endpoints. You have flexibility to do everything that you want. You even have a shutdown endpoint that's, as I've said, not the defaultly accessible. It's not accessible by default because of security purposes, but if you want it, we could even activate the shutdown endpoint, and then you can use the Actuator shutdown endpoint to shut it down. We have seen we could use the information endpoint. We have seen as well the health endpoint, and how do you customize the health endpoint, that you can use some custom components, or you can use some of your own that you decide, like using the internal memory or some other metrics. We have seen that we have metrics by default provided by the Actuator. We can even create our own metrics if we want, and we can integrate the metrics out of the box with most of the systems that provide possibility to monitor your applications only by configuring some properties in the properties file. So very easy to use this Actuator, and really important for the applications in production. You will always use the Actuator in production for your applications to integrate the applications with your environment. I hope everything that I have said makes sense, and I hope that you have understood the importance, but also how to use everything that I have shown you, which are probably 90% or even more than what we will find out to be needed whenever you will write your production application. But if you have questions, or if I have missed something, or I didn't explain something well, you already know that you can always ping me, find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or send me questions, other questions as well in the comments section, and I will try to respond them as soon as possible with a separate video in which I will do also some coding to show you how to work with those features. So thank you very much for being here with me.